Hello and welcome to Lesson 3 of the Advanced Music Theory course on Fundamental Harmony. So in this lesson we're going to be looking at some of the principles of voice leading, some of the terminologies that we use to describe particular melodies or particular chords. So most of the terms that you're going to need to know in this course we'll cover in this lesson. And also at the end of the lesson we'll be looking at some very basic harmonization. So the first thing that I want to go over is just a few chord descriptions that you need to be familiar with. Chords and triads can be described as concordant and also known as common chords, and these tend to be all your major and minor chords. And remember from the last lesson that if it's a major chord or triad, it's a capital Roman numeral that you use to analyze it, or if it's a minor chord or triad, it's a lowercase Roman numeral that you use to analyze it. But all of those chords together are called concordant chords or common chords because they sound good together, and they're probably the most frequently used chords that you'll ever come across, not only in classical music but in most music, folk music, pop music, anything like that. But you also have discordant triads and chords. And these will be your augmented chords and triads and your diminished chords and triads. And if you remember from the previous lesson, when you're analysing an augmented chord, you use capital letter Roman numerals, but you also add that wee plus symbol next to those Roman numerals, just to distinguish the augmented chord from a major chord. Because augmented chords and major chords, as you've already seen from the previous slides as well, your previous lessons, augmented chords and major chords both have a major third, but major chords have a perfect fifth, whereas augmented chords have an augmented fifth. So in order to distinguish between augmented and major chords, you need that plus symbol next to your capital Roman numerals, so you don't confuse them with major chords, which also have capital Roman numerals. Diminished chords and triads, yes, as well. We came across them. They're analysed using lowercase Roman numerals, and you also use that wee circle to indicate that it's fully diminished, or the wee circle with a line through it to indicate that it's half diminished. We'll come across those terms in a second as well. I'm going to go deeper into what I mean by half diminished and fully diminished. We've already covered it in the previous lesson, but I want to go over it again because it's something that is quite difficult for students to come to grips with if they're not used to it. So augmented chords and diminished chords are both types of discordant chords. They're chords that have a bit of dissonance in them. They don't sound as complete as major or minor chords, so they're not used as frequently as concordant chords, especially augmented chords. In fact, augmented chords are very rarely used. You will be coming across diminished chords quite often, actually, on the supertonic and the leading note, especially in minor keys. Supertonic and the leading note chords tend to be diminished chords, so they're common enough. But by far the most popular would be major and minor chords. Okay, they probably take up about 80 to 90% of all the music that you'll ever have to analyze or listen to, especially in classical music in the Baroque period. So you should be coming across a lot of major chords, a lot of minor chords, some diminished chords scattered here and there throughout the music, and very, very rarely augmented chords. Chords and triads can also be described as primary chords or primary triads. Your primary chords are basically your tonic, your subdominant, and your dominant, both in major and in minor keys. They're the most popular chords that you will be using. In fact, a lot of music, especially pop music, can be completely based just on your tonic, your subdominant, and your dominant, and inversions of those chords as well. And it's the same actually in a lot of classical music. That sort of 1, 4, 5, back to your 1 again, tends to be very popular in classical music as well. So yeah, chords 1, chords 4, and chords 5, and the major keys, they're all capital. Okay, so they're all uppercase Roman numerals for your tonic, your subdominant, your dominant. But in your minor keys, your tonic is a lowercase Roman numeral, your subdominant is a lowercase Roman numeral, but it's also an uppercase Roman numeral in minor keys for your dominant, because you've got your leading note in your dominant chord in minor keys, and that leading note is raised. Usually it's raised, that seventh is going to be raised. So because that seventh is raised, that affects the quality of your dominant chord, making it a major chord. So your dominant chord is major, a major chord, regardless if you're in a major or a minor key. Nearly all the time it's a major chord. So watch out for your tonic and your subdominant, because they could be major chords if you're in a major key, but they'll be minor chords if you're in a minor key. And they're the most popular chords that you're going to be using. Your primary chords, your tonic, your subdominant, and your dominant. But you'll also have to include secondary chords here and there, just for interest, out of harmonic interest. You can't have a whole piece that's just going to go through 1, 4, and 5. You can actually, in pop music, there's actually tune books. I'm sure you've probably come across them at some stage, that you can buy tune books, learn 100 rock pieces using just 3 chords, and probably the 3 chords they're talking about are your tonic, your subdominant, and your dominant. But there's a lot of music that does use other chords in a piece just to make it a bit more interesting, especially your supertonic and your submediant. They're probably the next 2 most common chords, followed by the leading note chord, and the very last, your mediant. I've already said that in the previous lesson. Your mediant chord's hardly used, and especially if it's an augmented mediant chord, which is what it would be in if you're using the harmonic minor for your minor keys. You can see that it's a capital, that median chord is a capital Roman numerals with a wee plus sign. That is very rarely used. Your supertonic is quite frequently used, so it's a minor chord, as you can see, lowercase Roman numerals for major keys, but it's a diminished chord in minor keys. Your submediant chord is quite frequently used. It's a minor chord in major keys, and paradoxically it's a major chord in minor keys. And your leading note chord tends to be a diminished chord in both major and minor keys. Okay, so again, those are all secondary chords. They're not as frequently used. They're not as important as your primary chords. You'll also see when we come to things like cadences that your primary chords are very important for establishing cadences, like authentic cadences and things like that. So very, very important that you understand that those 3 chords, your tonic, your subdominant, and your dominant, are the primary chords that you're going to be using. But be aware of those secondary chords as well. So that's basically most of the terms you're going to need for chord descriptions. There are 1 or 2 others that we need to go through, other terminologies. So we already looked at this in the previous lesson, but I just want to go over it again. Fully diminished chords, which are signified by that little circle symbol, and also if it's going to be a 7th chord, you can put your 7 in as well. So I'm going to be looking at a fully diminished 7th chord here, and it's going to consist of a minor 3rd, a diminished 5th, and a diminished 7th. So there's 2 diminished intervals in there, so you can see that's what gives it a full diminished chord, is those 2 diminished intervals. The distance between each interval is actually a minor 3rd. We'll see that in the chord we're about to look at. So you can look at it as the chord being made up of a minor 3rd between the bottom note and the first note above it, or between the diminished 5th between the bottom note and the next note above it, or between the bottom note and the top note, which is a diminished 7th. But there's another way of looking at fully diminished chords, and that is to look at them as the distance of a minor 3rd between each note. Okay, so yeah, here's where diminished 7th chord, fully diminished 7th chord, naturally occurs as a 7th chord on the leading note in minor keys. So in the key is C minor, remember that your leading note chord is actually going to be based on that raised 7th, because you're in C minor. Remember, you need to raise your 7th, your leading note. So the whole chord is going to be based on that raised leading note. So it's going to be based on that B natural. And the distance between that B and the D above it is a minor 3rd. Between the D and the F is a minor 3rd. And between the F and the A flat is a minor 3rd. Okay, so that's one way of looking at it. But you can also look at the fully diminished chord the other way, in that between the root and the 3rd is a minor 3rd. Between the root and the 5th is a diminished 5th. And the root and the 7th is a diminished 7th. Okay, so there's 2 ways of looking at a fully diminished chord. If whatever makes the most sense to you, just memorize it. You can look at it in terms of a minor 3rd between each note, or you can just look at the relationship between each note and the bass note, or the root. Okay, so that's where you get your minor 3rd, your diminished 5th, and your diminished 7th. So if I was to take away that diminished 7th, if I was to take away that A flat at the top, it's still going to be a fully diminished chord, because you're going to have a diminished 5th between your root and your 5th. okay, between your B natural and your F. So fully diminished chords, the way that I remember what is a fully diminished chord, if the distance between the bottom note and the top note is diminished, whether or not it's a seventh chord or not, if the distance between the root and the top note is a diminished interval, then it's a fully diminished chord. So just imagine, if you can, that A flat on top of that chord isn't there. The distance then between the bottom note and the top note is a diminished fifth between that B and the F. Add the seventh on top, and now you've got a diminished seventh, so it's still a fully diminished chord. Okay. So if the distance between the bottom note and the top note is diminished, it's a fully diminished chord. And I've just given you an example of a fully diminished seventh chord, just to make it a bit more comprehensive. So let's now look at a half diminished chord. And again, we're going to look at a seventh half diminished chord. So you're going to, the symbol for that to signify that is still the wee circle, but you need to put a line through it to signify that it's half diminished, and then your 7 next to it. So half diminished chords consist of a minor third, a diminished fifth, and a minor seventh. Okay, so no longer a diminished seventh, you have a minor seventh now. And these chords are actually quite popular because they naturally occur excuse me, on major keys as the seventh chord of the leading note, and in minor keys as the seventh chord of the supertonic. So in major keys, you're going to come across half diminished chords if your leading note chord is a seventh chord, and in minor keys, you're going to come across half diminished chords if your supertonic chord is a seventh chord. Okay, so here, we'll just take the major one first of all. Here is your leading note chord with a seventh. It's kind of difficult to describe this because you're talking about the leading note chord, the seventh chord of the key, with a seventh added on top of that chord. So it's a seventh chord, the leading note chord, with a seventh as well. And that makes it a half diminished chord, because the distance between your B and your D is a minor third, just as it was before. The distance between your B and your F is a diminished fifth, just as it was before. But now the difference between your B and your A is a minor seventh. It's not A flat like it was for fully diminished chords in the previous slide. It's just between B and A. So that's just a minor seventh. So as you can see, that chord has 2 minor intervals and 1 diminished interval, so it's only a half diminished chord. It hasn't got the full quality of a fully diminished chord, hasn't got that quality of a fully diminished chord. Let's look at the same type of chord but now in a minor key. Let's keep it in C minor actually. And we're now in the supertonic. Okay, so we're basing this chord on D, your supertonic degree of the scale. So your chord's going to be based on your supertonic, and you're going to add a seventh on top of that. So now the distance between your D and your F is a minor third, between your D and your A flat, because remember we're in C minor. So D to A flat is a diminished fifth, and between D and your C is a minor seventh. So it's still the same distances between those notes as it was in the major key. If you look at the first example, all I've done is just switch it into a minor key, and now it's on. Those half diminished chords occur on supertonic and minor keys, but they occur on the leading note chord in major keys. So the distance between the bottom note and the top note is a minor seventh, so that's what makes it half diminished. So again, if the distance between the bottom note and the top note is a diminished interval, then it's a fully diminished chord. But now the difference between the bottom note and the top note is a minor seventh, so it's only a half diminished chord. Now this is where it can get quite interesting. Remember in the last slide I told you to imagine if you take the top note away, what does that do to the chord? Well, let's do the same thing here. If you were to take away, in that first example, if you were to take away that A natural, that minor seventh, in the key of C major, if you take away that A, you've actually changed what would have been a half diminished chord into a fully diminished chord, because now the distance between the B and the F is a diminished fifth. So as soon as you add that A natural on top of that leading note chord, you've actually changed the quality of the chord to make it a half diminished chord. Okay, because you've got a minor seventh now. Take away that A, take away that minor seventh interval, and you're back to a fully diminished chord. Same thing in the key of C minor for your supertonic seventh chord. Take away that C at the top of that chord, and you're back to a fully diminished chord, because the distance between your D and your A flat is a diminished fifth. So remember, that's a handy wee rule, I suppose, or a handy wee tip to remember the difference between diminished and fully diminished and half diminished chords. Is the distance between the top note and the bottom note a diminished interval? And if it is, then chances are it's going to be a fully diminished chord, I should say, a fully diminished chord. If the distance between that bottom note and the top note is a minor interval, for example, then it's going to be a half diminished chord. Okay, so just something to bear in mind. So I now want to look at some of the principles or guidelines that you need to know when you're dealing with voice leading. Okay, so from here on out, I'm going to be giving you exercises on how to write music for 4-part harmony for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. So there's a couple of things you obviously need to know before you can do that. So I'm just going to go through those guidelines now. So the very first thing you should be aware of is the range that you're going to be using for each voice part. Okay, so I've just briefly summarized here the ranges of a bass singer, a tenor singer, an alto singer, and a soprano singer. Now, obviously, their different textbooks will differ slightly on this. There are occasions when the a bass singer may be able to go lower than that, for example, but you want these voice parts to be in a comfortable range, so try not to go too far to the extremes of too low or too high for each voice part. So try and keep it somewhere within the ranges that I've shown you here for each voice part. Okay, so in your examinations, in your coursework, you will lose marks if you're writing voice parts which are very, very difficult, if not impossible, for the voice parts to sing. So yeah, just look at the ranges there and see if you can come up with a way of memorizing it. For me, it's usually just F, C, C to G, and then for the first two, for bass and tenor, F to C for the bass, C to G for the tenor, G to C for the alto, and then C to G for the soprano. So they're almost related to each other, I suppose, their ranges. Yeah, so try and keep it within a normal range for each voice part. The other thing to remember is avoid wide gaps, no more than an octave between the tenor and alto and between the alto and soprano. Okay, so try not to have wide voice parts. In fact, not try not to have, just don't have wide gaps between the voice parts, the upper voice parts, because it make the music sound quite bare, quite stark. You want the upper voices to be quite close together. It's actually okay to have wide gaps between the bass and the tenor. So just to go through the examples there, you can see the first example, the notes at the bottom are the bass, the notes above it are the tenor, the notes above that are the alto, and the very top notes are the soprano lines. So you can see the very first chord that all 4 voices will sing together is pretty good. You have an octave between your bass and your tenor, but between the tenor and the alto and the soprano, they're all very close together. The second example is also pretty good. Even though you've got more than an octave between the bass and the tenor, that's completely fine. In fact, it's going to happen quite a lot. So your bass is basically the anchor for all the other notes, but all the other notes have got to be pretty close together. Again, the third chord is okay as well. It's not as good as the first one or the second one because there is a bit of a gap between G and E, between the alto and the soprano, but it's not massive. It's not more than an octave, so that's okay. It's just an okay chord, I suppose. The last 2 examples are bad. As you can see, between the tenor and the alto in the second last chord is more than an octave, so that's pretty bad. And what's even worse is probably the last one, between the alto and the soprano is more than an octave as well. Okay, it'll sound quite stark, it'll sound quite too spaced out. In fact, there'll be probably too much, attention given to the soprano line because it's way out on its own. Okay, so you don't want that. You want each line to have equal importance, and the best way to achieve that is to have all the voices as close together as possible, except between the bass and the tenor. So that's just a wee rule to remember. Between the bass and the tenor, you can have more than an octave, but not between any other voice part. Another rule to remember when you're writing for voices is to know which note to double. We've already seen this in the previous lessons that your chords are based on triads, And triads are only made up of 3 notes, but you have 4 voices to deal with: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. So usually one of those notes, one of those notes from the triad is going to be doubled, unless you're using a 7th chord, in which case you don't have to. But if you're going to be basing your chords on those triads, you have to figure out which note are you going to double and give to a voice line. Avoid doubling the third for any primary chords. So for chords 1, 4, and 5, for your tonic, your subdominant, and your dominant, don't double the third of the chord. Okay, so you can see the very first chord there, they're all C chords, C, E, G chords. So you've got a C in the bass, an E in the tenor, a G in the alto, and a C in the soprano. So you've got a C, E, G, C. You've doubled the root. Okay, you've doubled that C. That's completely fine. Okay, in fact, that's the best one to double, is the root of the chord. The next one, we've got a C, G, E, and G. So a C in the bass, a G in the tenor, an E in the alto, and a G in the soprano. So this time I've doubled the 5th. Okay, that's okay as well, but it's not as good as the first one. The bad one is the last one, where I've doubled the third of the chord. I've got a C in the bass, an E in the tenor, a G in the alto, and an E again in the soprano. So there's your 2 E's. Okay, I've doubled the third. Try to avoid doing that for primary chords. In fact, I'd almost go so far as to say avoid doubling the thirds just for now, for any chord. Just avoid doubling the third. There will be occasions where you will have to actually double the third. We'll get to that later in the course. There are 1 or 2 exceptions that you have to learn for this rule, but the general rule is avoid doubling the third for any primary chords. For secondary chords, like all the other chords besides the tonic, the subdominant, and the dominant, you may have to double a third, especially if they are in first inversion or if they form part of a cadence. Okay, so for now, just don't double the third. Just keep that in the back of your head. Keep it in the back burner that doubling the third is bad, and there may be occasions though when you have to do it, but just know that it's not good practice for most primary chords. Okay, for your tonic, your subdominant, and your dominant. There will be exceptions to all this later, but just for now, keep that rule in mind. Avoid doubling the third. Also, suppose of a very general rule to remember is quite a simple one actually. It's just remembering the direction that your stems are going for your soprano line, your alto line, your tenor line, and your bass line. So it just makes it easier to read for musicians. Makes it easier for musicians. It also makes it easier for analysts like us to look at the piece and know which voice part is singing what. So the soprano and the tenor lines will always have their stems going upwards. Okay, and you can see that's regardless of pitch, their stems always go upwards. And also the bass and the alto will always have their stems going downwards. Okay, so regardless of pitch again. Again, this just makes the voice leading easy to read. That's the only reason why it's done like this. It just makes it much easier to read. So you're able to keep track of your own voice part. Say if you're an alto singer and you have a tenor beneath you and a soprano above you, you want to be able to see your own line pretty easily. So having the stems all going down will make that easy for you, and likewise for the other voice parts as well. So that's a simple rule. Also want to look at melodic motion between the voices. They can be in contrary motion, that's pretty good. So that's when 2 voices move in opposite directions. So you can see here, I've just given just to make it easier to read, I've just given the soprano and alto line. You can see that the 2 voice parts are moving in opposite directions. So when the soprano moves up from the B to the D, the alto line moves down from the G to the D. So you can see that they sort of move in opposite directions to each other. So that's quite good voice writing. Similar motion is okay, but try to avoid this. That's when 2 voices move in the same direction, but the intervals vary. You have to be very careful when you're doing this that you don't have any consecutive or parallel perfect fifths and octaves. I'll get on to what that means later, but you'll see in a minute why this voice leading isn't as good, because it can lead to some very bad mistakes that you have to avoid. So yeah, watch out for similar motion. It's okay, but try to avoid it. Parallel motion is okay if it's a third, fourth, or sixth. So you can see here that the voices are moving in thirds. It may be okay for fourths and sixths as well. It will depend on context, basically. Parallel motion. That's when two voices move in the same direction at the same interval. You never ever do that for fifths or octaves. That's what we call consecutive or parallel fifths and octaves. Again, I'll go into this later. There's another slide for consecutive fifths and octaves. And the very last type of melodic motion is oblique motion. This is excellent if you're able to do this when you're writing for four voices. One voice remains motionless while the other moves. I know that sounds quite boring, but it's actually the best type of voice parts for students. I usually advise my students that if you're moving from one chord to the next chord and you have the same note in those two chords, if that note is in one voice part, keep it in the next voice part as well. So the rule is, if you don't have to move, then don't. So if the voice part doesn't have to move, then don't let it move. And if you have to move, then move by the smallest distance possible. Okay, so the two best melodic motions on that page are country motion, where you have the voices moving in opposite directions, and that's good. But what's even better is oblique motion, when one voice doesn't go anywhere while the other voice moves. Okay, you're going to avoid all the nasty things that we're going to look at later, like consecutive and parallel fifths and octaves, hidden fifths and octaves, augmented intervals. All these things you have to avoid when you're writing for voices. So if the voice doesn't move, you're not going to come across any of those nasty things. So just watch out for similar motion and parallel motion, especially parallel motion, because you don't having two voices moving in the same direction at the same interval can lead to a lot of problems. And yeah, that's basically all we need to go over for melodic motion. So oblique motion is the best. One voice remains motionless while the other moves. Country motion is the next best. Two voices moving in opposite directions. Similar motion's okay. Two voices moving in the same direction, but the intervals vary. And then parallel motion, when two voices move in the same direction, but the intervals are also the same. Okay, so that's the least favorable one, I reckon. It's okay for thirds, as you can see. It's actually sound pretty good, actually, for thirds or for sixths, but definitely not for fifths or octaves. Okay. Melodic motion for individual voices can also be just described as conjunct. That's pretty good. That's a voice which remains still or moves stepwise. So again, this is the thing that I want you guys to do based on the similar rule that I described in the previous slide. If you don't have to move, then don't. But if you have to move, move by as little as possible. Stepwise is by far the most preferable. And this is what I want you to avoid: disjunct. A voice which moves by more than a step. You can see that melody there is jumping all over the place between the D to the G, back down to the D, back up to the G, down to an E, way up to a C, down to a G, back up to the C. It's not as pleasing actually to listen to. There are actually rules for writing nice melodic lines, and if you're reading any of the Walter Piston material on counterpoint, we'll be doing that later as well. One of the good rules for writing melodies is to try and keep it conjunct and have a sort of an arc where you're flowing upwards to a high point and then falling back down again, or you're starting at a high point and falling down low and then going back up high. So the worst type of melodic writing for a voice part or for any instrument even is to be jumping all over the place in a zigzag motion. Of course, all these rules, guys, go way out the window when we're dealing with 20th century music. In fact, a lot of 20th century music does have very spiky melodies and spiky rhythms that jump up and down. But remember, for this course, we're just trying to write in the style of Baroque and early classical music as well. So you want to keep your melodies nice and smooth, moving up and down by step, or not even moving at all if you're writing for choral music, because the other voices will be moving. That takes care of the interest for you, the harmonic interest, if other voices are moving. So yeah, try not to have too much of a wide leap in your melodies. And this is the thing that I wanted to get on to, I talked about a couple of slides back, and that was consecutive perfect fifths and octaves. This is what you've got to avoid, and this is the bane of all undergraduate students when they're first learning how to write in the style of a Bach chorale. This is the thing that everybody hates, is perfect fifths and octaves, and yeah, unfortunately there's only one way really. to check for all your perfect fifths and octaves, and that is to go through every single chord and check between the bass and the tenor, the bass and the alto, the bass and the soprano, then move up and check between your tenor and the alto and the tenor and soprano, and then move up again and check between the alto and the soprano for any perfect fifths or octaves between the chords. Unfortunately, it's quite a laborious task to do, but you'll get used to it. You'll get quicker as you go along. So at the very beginning, it's quite a hard thing to do because it slows up your voice writing, and it can take quite a long time just to go back over and check for perfect fifths and octaves. And then when you do find them, you find, oh no, I have to rewrite the voice parts, which may have a knock-on effect for all the voice parts around the chord. It can completely change your phrase, or you may even have to change chords. So it can have a horrible knock-on effect if you find you're coming across quite a lot of perfect fifths and octaves. So once you've gone through between all your voice parts, you may come across a very bad practice that we can see here. This is a piece of music that I actually wrote when I was doing my A-levels, actually, when I was still in secondary school. And I was doing it to see where I could spot consecutive fifths and octaves, and wait till you see how many there are. So between the F and the C in the first chord, between the alto and the soprano part, you can see how that's a fifth apart, and then those two parts move on to the next chord, but they're a fifth apart. So that's what we consider a consecutive perfect fifth. That's really bad. Okay. Sometimes they're actually called parallel fifths and octaves. That's probably more common, actually. Maybe in America to call them parallel fifths and octaves, but I was brought up to call them actually just consecutive perfect fifths and octaves. Also be careful of consecutive perfect fifths and octaves in opposite directions. That's going to occur in this piece as well. I'll show you that in a second. So yeah, there's an example of a consecutive perfect fifth, or the very first bar between the two top voice parts. We actually do have examples of people like Mozart, especially Mozart. In fact, they're actually called Mozart fifths. We have some established composers who are writing compositions that actually do have perfect fifths in them, and a lot of students get quite frustrated and annoyed that they're allowed to do the composers are allowed to do it, but their teachers like me are telling them not to do it. It is possible sometimes to have consecutive perfect fifths and octaves under very specific circumstances. I'll deal with that much later on in the course, because the rule is just to avoid all consecutive perfect fifths and octaves. So I don't want to start giving you at this early stage all the different exceptions to this rule. But there are one or two. And also, if you're used to playing rock and pop music, you'll probably find that if you're playing rock piano or pop music on the piano, you'll probably find that a lot of your left-hand chords are moving up by octaves. Okay, between your thumb and your little finger, you're probably playing a lot of octaves in your left hand. So, in the style of a Bach chorale, and in fact in most music, in classical music, you'll find that composers tend to avoid perfect fifths and octaves, because the distance of a fifth and the distance of an octave, they're naturally strong intervals anyway. You don't want to give them any more prominence than they already have. So if you were to hear voices sing the chords that we've written here, to sing this music, you'll probably hear the soprano and the alto far too much over the bass and the tenor. So they're naturally strong intervals, fifths and octaves, so you don't want to give them any undue or any more attention than they need. Okay, so remember, you're trying to give as much equal attention to each voice part, so that's what makes it very pleasing to listen to, is when you're actually able to pick out all the different melodic lines, all the different parts, the bass, the alto, and the soprano, and the tenor. Okay, so try and avoid perfect consecutive fifths. There's also another consecutive perfect fifth in that first bar, and it's between the bass and the soprano, and that's even worse because it's between the outer voices now. So again, you're hearing that interval of a fifth even more. So not only do you have it between the alto and the soprano, you have it between the bass and the soprano as well. So between the outer voices, it's even worse. Between the F and the C and the bass and the alto, or bass and the soprano, and between the G and the D in the bass and the soprano. So there is two examples of consecutive perfect fifths before we've even gotten to the third chord. In the third bar, you can see again there, maybe a bit easier to see this one, between the F and the C, between the bass and the tenor is a fifth, and again between the G and the D is a fifth. So again, there's consecutive perfect fifths. Okay, so again, you're trying to avoid that. Now we're moving on to the octaves. I've got the octaves in blue. This is what you want to avoid again. So you can see here between the bass and the alto is an octave. They're both Fs. And between the bass and the alto and the next chord is an octave. They're both Gs. So you want to avoid that. So it's not going too well so far. And this, again, bearing in mind, this is what I wrote when I was very young, before I went to college. But still, a lot of mistakes. So you only learn by your mistakes, basically. So being able to go back over your work and check for consecutive perfect fifths and octaves, you are going to do it. So don't worry, you are going to make this mistake of consecutive perfect fifths and octaves. I'd be amazed if you didn't have this in your homeworks or your coursework. The trick is to be able to spot your mistakes and correct them. So yeah, in the third bar there, we can see again between your F in the bass and the F in the alto, moving to a G in the bass and a G in the alto. So again, consecutive octaves. Now there's one more. I wonder if anyone can spot it. If you're able to spot it, well done. But there's another example of consecutive octaves. I'll give you a hint. They're moving in opposite directions. It's that part, that very last part in the writing there. Be careful of consecutive perfect fifths and octaves moving in opposite directions. I wonder if you can spot where it is. Pause the video and see if you can find it. So if you weren't able to find it, I'll just show you now. It's between these two notes. So you have the second chord in the bass, you've got a G, and in the alto part you also have a G, and you're moving from a G in the bass down to a C in the next chord in the bass, and also in the alto you're moving from a G into the next chord, you're moving to a C as well. They are still considered consecutive octaves because you're moving from a G in both voice parts to a C in both voice parts, even though they're moving in opposite directions. So be very careful of that. This is another reason why I want you guys to write smooth voice leading. Avoid having to move from one voice part to the next, and if you have to move by as little as possible. You can see what happens when you have two voice parts that are jumping quite a lot. You have the alto, which is jumping up a fourth between the G and the C, and you have the bass, which is jumping a fifth between the G and the C. So that's what happens when you have your voice parts which are jumping all over the place. Keep the melodies, keep the lines conjunct. Okay, remember the golden rule: if you don't have to move, then don't, and if you have to move by as little as possible. Also, just watch out for hidden fifths and octaves. You'll be very unlucky to do this. There's certain things that have to happen in order for this to occur. So hidden perfect fifths and octaves occur when the outer voices, so it's just the outer voices, move in the same direction onto a perfect fifth or octave, with the top part not moving by step. Okay, so there's a lot of things that need to happen. So you'd be very unlucky to trip up here because there's so many things that you have to do wrong in order for this to happen. So they're also sometimes called exposed fifths and octaves, and I'll show you an example. Here you can see you've got between your F is moving to a G in the bass and your soprano is moving to an A in the D. Now in the bass, between that G and the D is considered a fifth, a perfect fifth. Okay. And you can see that both voice parts are moving in the same direction, but the top part's not moving by step. Again, the reason why you avoid this is because it gives, again, too much prominence to that perfect fifth interval, because you're moving by a jump. It's almost like a surprise, that the voice is jumping onto that note in the soprano, and the listener, when they listen to that, will hear just that perfect fifth too prominently. It's too much. Okay, so avoid those hidden perfect fifths and octaves as well. So that's basically, that whole slide is about avoiding consecutive perfect fifths and octaves. I know I've gone on about it for quite a long time, but please do pay attention to it, because if you find a perfect fifth and octave in your writing, you'll have to go back and swap over the voice parts and maybe change the chord, and that has a knock-on effect going further back, because anytime you change something, if you change the voice parts, then you've got to go back over and check again, are there still any consecutive perfect fifths and octaves, and if there are, you've got to change it again. And you may have made consecutive perfect fifths and octaves appear where there weren't any before if you're changing your chords. So be very careful of this. The way to get around it is to avoid having to go through all this horrible work is to move by as little as possible, and if you don't have to move, then don't move, okay, from one voice part or from one line to the next chord. So within that, your melodic lines, within your voice parts, move as little as possible, and even better is not to move at all, okay. Also watch out if you're moving from one chord, like a chord 4 to chord 5. A lot of people, especially pianists, when they first come across this, their natural tendency is just to move everything up one note. So if you imagine playing, for example, and you're a key of C major and you're playing an F chord on the piano, and you want to, that's your chord 4, your subdominant chord, and you want to move to your dominant chord, which is a G chord, there's a natural tendency amongst pianists to just move everything up one step. If you do that, you've got consecutive perfect fifths and octaves in every voice part because you've moved everything up a step. So be careful when you're moving from one chord to the next that are right next door to each other. So moving from chord 4 to chord 5, or chord 5 to chord 6, or chord 7 to chord 1, all those chords are adjacent to each other, and the worst thing to do is just to move everything up by step. You can actually see that example here. The very first bar in that top example, I've got an F A C chord moving to a G B D chord moving to a C E G chord. So chord 4 to chord 5 to chord 1, and you can see what happens if I'm moving from chord 4 to chord 5 and I'm just moving everything up a step. You're going to get loads of perfect fifths and octaves. So just watch out for that. Again, you can see the hidden perfect octaves this time in that second example. You can see that the bass note is moving from an F to a G, and the soprano line is moving from a C to a G, and between the bass and the soprano is a G. So again, it's between the outer voices. They're both moving in the same direction, and the top voice is moving by a leap. So again, guys, you'd be very unlucky to stumble upon this because you're meant to be writing music which is in oblique or contrary motion, so your voice parts should try to go in opposite directions. Okay, so if you've got two voice parts moving in the same direction, they're both moving on to a perfect fifth or octave, and the top one is moving not by a step, by a leap, then there's a couple of rules you're breaking. You don't have nice conjunct motion in your upper part. You've got voice parts which are moving in the same direction instead of contrary motion or oblique motion, and you're meant to be checking for parallel and hidden fifths, or sorry, consecutive perfect fifths and octaves and hidden perfect fifths and octaves. So yeah, there's quite a few mistakes you have to do in order to stumble into a perfect fifth, hidden perfect fifth, or a hidden perfect octave. So yeah, this is probably a good slide to look over and revise. If there's a lot that doesn't make sense to you, then I advise you to get in contact with me, because it's something that you're going to have to do right up until the end of the course. Okay, so you're going to have to check for consecutive perfect fifths and octaves and hidden perfect fifths and octaves the whole way through your music. Maybe not so much hidden perfect fifths and octaves if your voice parts are moving in opposite directions, or if they're moving smoothly. You don't have to worry about hidden perfect fifths and octaves, but definitely consecutive perfect fifths and octaves. You need to be very good at being able to spot them. So if you have any trouble, please get in contact with me and I'll give you some additional help with that. So there's something else that I want to come on to now, and that is the idea of the leading note of the key. Wherever it appears in a chord, it should normally rise to the tonic in the same voice part in the next chord. And I've given you an example here. This is just two chords in the key of C major, so just imagine this could be any two chord progressions in C major. But here we have the dominant chord first, the G B D chord, moving to the tonic chord, the C E G chord. And you can actually see that the leading note is in the soprano part of the dominant chord. So you can see that B is the leading note of the key. So if you count 7 up basically from C, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, that's then your leading note of the key, and it is rising, as you can see, up to the tonic, which is your C, basically your first degree of the scale. So that is why it's called the leading note. It wants to lead up to that tonic. It wants to be rising upwards. It wants to rise. So that leading note, there's a natural pull up to the tonic. When you listen to that, and when you're listening to this chord progression, it sounds like a natural thing to do, to rise up from that B to the C. Okay, so that's something that you have to bear in mind, that whatever key that you're in, just watch out for the leading note, the 7th degree of the scale, and if it appears in your chord, and it usually does appear in the dominant chord, for example, and the dominant chord's very popular, so it usually appears in the dominant chord. Wherever it appears, it usually goes up in the same voice part. It usually rises. Unfortunately, I have to show you an exception to this at the very start, because there is a common exception to this rule. So sometimes, to achieve a fuller sonority, that 7th may actually fall, the leading note may actually fall to the dominant degree, in other words the 5th degree of the scale. But if that happens, another voice part must provide that needed tonic. So here we have a progression in A minor. We have that G sharp, which is your leading note. Okay, if you count 7 up from A, B, C, D, E, F, G, it's your leading note, and remember it's sharpened because you're in a minor key. The 7th is always raised. So that 7th is falling down to the 5th. It's of the key. It's falling down to the E. It's falling down to the 5th degree of the key. But the soprano line, or the soprano voice circled in green, that comes down to the rescue. Okay, so even if you were to listen to that chord progression, you would actually think that G sharp has risen. You'd actually think that it's gone upwards to that A. You need to have very good ears to hear it actually falling down to the E. So your ear is tricked into believing that the G sharp has risen to an A. Okay, so that's why that voice part, that soprano part, has got to come down to the rescue to provide that tonic that is missing. Because usually the alto part, you can see that G sharp, usually in that alto part would have to go up to an A, but it falls down to an E, so then the soprano has got to come down to fill out that A. Okay, so that's probably the one major, if not the only real exception you're going to come across in this course. So nearly all the time the leading note of the key, the 7th degree of the key, has to rise. And there may be occasions, just to achieve a fuller sounding chord on that A minor, that it may have to fall. Okay, so it's falling down to the 5th degree. But if that happens, then another voice part must provide that needed tonic that would otherwise be missing. So you can see that the soprano does that in this example. The soprano comes down and sounds that A. So for the last part of this lesson, or for most of the last part of this lesson, I want to go over a couple of rules of when to use secondary chords. We've already seen at the start of this lesson that your primary chords, your tonic, your subdominant, and your dominant are very common chords. Like they're going to be the chords you're going to use most often, and they're going to occur everywhere in your phrases, at the beginning, at the middle, especially at the end for cadences. So the question then you have to ask yourself is, so if I'm going to be using primary chords all the time, when do I insert secondary chords? When can I use secondary chords? Well, I've just done a few guidelines to follow. When to use secondary chords, we'll look at the supertonic first because it's probably the most popular. So, of the secondary chords. It's mostly used at cadences with the dominant. Okay, so you could have, for example, a 5-1 progression to end a phrase. Okay, that's considered a cadence, an authentic cadence. You could have a 2-5-1 before that. So chord 2 is mostly used as a predominant chord, a chord that comes before chord 5. Okay, it's very popular in that respect. It is usually in first inversion, so in fact you'll probably have to analyze it as a 2 with the 6 next to it. It sounds even better as a 7th chord. So in root position that would be a 2 of a 7 next to it, but remember it's usually in first inversion, so you'd have to write it as a 2 6 5, 6 5 signifying a 7th chord in first inversion. Okay, so that's probably the most common one you're going to come across. And it can be used as an alternative to the subdominant chord 4, in other words, because they share so many notes. In fact, if you look at the examples beneath there, in the key of C major, you can see that your supertonic chord, your chord 2 is a DFA, and your subdominant chord is an FAC, so you can see the overlap between each chord. Each chord has an F and each chord has an A. Okay, so there's 2 notes in common between each chord, and that relationship's even stronger if you make that supertonic chord a 7th chord. DFAC, you can now actually see that all of the subdominant chord is actually inside that supertonic 7th chord, the F, the A, and the C. So because chords 2 and chords 4 share so many notes, and in fact they share all the notes if you make the the supertonic chord a 7th chord, because they share so many notes, they can actually be swapped about. So instead of a 1 4 5 1 progression, you could even have a 1 2 5 1 progression. Okay, so instead of 4 5 1, you can have 2 5 1 chord progression. So chords 2 and 4 are very similar and closely related in that respect. They're very good predominant chords, chords 2 and 4. So when to use the mediant chord? Well, it's as you probably already know from previous slides, it is rarely used. But when it is used, it's mostly used with the submediant, chord 6, and sometimes with the tonic, chord 1. And it can help decorate interrupted cadences, which we'll deal with in the next lesson, so you don't have to worry too much about that. But when we get to cadences, you can come back and look over mediant. The mediant chord, it can be sometimes used to decorate interrupted cadences. And it can be an alternative to chord 1 or chord 5 because they both share notes. But these chords, as you already know, they're both primary chords. These are stronger and far better to use. So you can see there in the key of C major, I've written the tonic chord, the mediant chord, and the dominant chord, and you can see the overlap between each one. Chord 1 has a CEG chord, or the chord 3 or the mediant chord has an EGB, and chord 5, the dominant chord, has a GBD. So now you know. Now it should be pretty clear why the mediant chord is rarely used, because 2 reasons. First of all, the tonic chord already contains 2 of the notes of the mediant chord. So, and the tonic chord obviously is probably the most powerful, most important, and strongest chord in whatever music you're writing, in any tonal music, in tonal music anyway. Your chord 1 is going to be the most important because that is your tonic chord. That establishes the key of your entire piece. So chord 1 is obviously the most important, and it already has 2 of the notes that chord 3 has. And if you actually look at the remaining note that it doesn't have, chord 1 doesn't have the B in it. But what is that B in the key of C major? It's your leading note. And where does the leading note want to rise to? Where is it being pulled towards? You'll naturally hear it being pulled upwards to the tonic. So that B wants to rise anyway to the tonic. So there's 2 reasons why the mediant chord is rarely used, I think anyway, in a lot of tonal music, especially Baroque music, Bach chorales and things like that, is because chord 3 is an unstable chord because 2 of the notes already belong to the tonic, and the one that doesn't belong to the tonic chord wants to naturally go up to the tonic chord anyway. So yeah, chord 3 isn't good to use. I said there can be used as an alternative to chord 1 or chord 5, but in reality you would use chord 1 and chord 5 99.9% of the time rather than chord 3, because chord 1 and chord 5 are far stronger chords than chord 3. And same thing for the dominant as well. Dominant already contains 2 of the notes of the median chord. It contains the G and the B. So the median chord and the dominant chord both have G's and both have B's. So again, you're better using a chord 5 if you can rather than a chord 3. So if you don't want to use a chord 1 all the time, but you want to have a G and a B in your chord, the chances are it's going to be a dominant chord you're going to use. Okay. So hopefully that makes a wee bit more sense now about why the mediant chord is considered the ugly duckling of all the triads you're going to use. It's probably the least used chord. So as a result of the similarities to chord 1, chord 3 is hardly used. So those two things to remember: two notes in the mediant chord already belong to the tonic chord, and the one that doesn't wants to pull up. It's the leading note that's being pulled up towards the tonic chord anyway. So anywhere you see a chord 3, if you've put in a chord 3, and unless it works, when it's being used in with submediant, for example, unless it's being used maybe in a circle of fifths or something like that, we'll come across that later, circle of fifths. So unless it's being used for a very specific purpose, I would tend to just change it to a chord 1. Okay, so if you find yourself using a chord 3, change it to a chord 1 unless you're using that chord 3 for a very specific purpose. So let's look now at the submediant chord. This is probably the most common secondary chord that we have, or at least it's just as important as the supertonic chord. The supertonic chord is usually reserved for cadences. It does occur elsewhere in music, but you'll tend to find that most of the time in the supertonic chord, chord 2, when it occurs, it's at a cadence, at a point of rest. The submediant chord is very popular throughout music. It can also be used in a cadence, like an interrupted cadence, for example, but it can also be used elsewhere in the music. So it's the most versatile secondary chord and can be used with the supertonic, the mediant, and the subdominant. And because of that versatility, because it can be used in so many different contexts, it's actually the most frequently used secondary chord. It's usually preceded by the tonic, so anytime you have a submediant chord, usually the chord that comes before it is the tonic, and that means that the bass will be falling by a third. Or it can be preceded by the dominant chord, in other words, to create a cadence, like an interrupted cadence. So it can also be used as an alternative to the subdominant chord, chord 4, or the tonic chord, chord 1, because they share notes. So basically you can see a pattern here. Anywhere where you have chords that share loads of notes, they can substitute one another. So you can see here in your key of C major that your subdominant chord is an FAC chord and your tonic chord obviously is CEG, and you can see the relationship, the overlap of notes between one chord and the next. The subdominant chord has an A and a C, and so the submediant chord also has an A and a C, and the tonic chord has an E and a G, and the submediant chord also has an E and a G. So the submediant chord can be used as an alternative to chord 4 or chord 1. In fact, the whole idea of being an alternative to chord 1, in fact, that's the whole basis of using the submediant chord in your interrupted cadences. Interrupted cadences is when you end a passage or a piece of music from chord 5 to chord 6, submediant chord, because you're expecting the chord 5, the dominant chord, to go to chord 1. Okay, that gives it a sense of finality, that the piece is completed. That's an authentic cadence. Okay, but moving from 5 to 6, it tricks the ear. Your ear is thinking that you're going to move to your chord 1, but you don't. You've moved to your chord 6, hence the term interrupted cadence. Okay, so yes, that's basically one of the primary functions of chord 6, is to be used as an alternative to chord 1. You get that a lot in pop music as well, by the way. When you're using a chord progression like 1, 2, 4, 5, 1, sometimes you may get 1, 2, 4, 5, chord 6 instead of going down to chord 1. And it's very effective. You should try it in whatever music that you're into, whatever instrument you play. Try playing it on the piano. Chords 1, 2, 4, 5, 1, and then 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, just to note the difference. And the last secondary chord we're going to look at is the leading note secondary chord. Now, it's not as rare as your mediant chord, but it is used under very specific circumstances, and usually with the tonic chord, because the root of the leading chord is the leading note that needs to rise. So because it's the leading chord, that root, say you're in the key of C major, your leading note is B, and that B wants to rise up to C, and because of that you can see that the leading note chord is going to have a very close relationship with the tonic, because the whole function of the leading note chord is that it wants to lead up to the tonic. So it's nearly always in first inversion, and it can appear in a couple of very special progressions, so please don't get frightened by this just yet. These are just quite common chord progressions called a passing 6-3. We'll deal with them much later on, but I'm just introducing them now just to be a bit comprehensive with dealing with secondary chords. So I'm not expecting you guys to understand this just yet, but we will come to it in later slides. So again, just put it in the back burner for now. So chord 7 is usually used in first inversion, and you can see here that it's flanked on either side by a chord 1, one of which is in root position and the other is in first inversion. Or you can swap those chord 1s about. You have the first inversion tonic chord first, followed by your leading note chord in first inversion, and then your tonic chord in root position. So that's quite a special example of when you use your leading note chord. And just to show you it in context, you can actually see that it's quite contrived if you actually look at the way the voices are moving. The bass is moving up C, D, E, the tenor is moving E, D, C, and the two upper voices are moving up and down by step. So again, it's following the golden rule that if you have to move by as little distance as possible. You can also see that at times the voices are in contrary motion to each other. So although between the first two chords, the bass is moving up and the soprano is moving down, the tenor is moving down and the alto is moving down, but then the tenor continues to move down in the third chord, but the alto moves back up. So you can see that it follows quite a few rules there, that it's nice conjunct writing. There's contrary motion and they're moving by as little as possible. So that's probably one of the occasions when you would use your leading note. You can also swap those two chords about. So you see that chord, that tonic chord with the 6 next to it, signifying the first inversion chord. You can swap that about so it comes first and the first chord comes last. So that's be used as a passing 6-3. That would be used in the music itself. Okay, so it's not used at cadences, in other words. But you can use a leading note chord at a cadence, as long as it ends on that final chord 1. So you can end cadences on an inversion, but you're better not. You're better not doing that, because you want your cadence to be a bit strong, you know, to sense that this is the end of a phrase or the end of the piece of music. So here's an example of a chord progression with your leading note chord in it. Again, it's flanked by two chord 1s, one of which is inverted, the first one, and the last one is in root position. And you can actually see how powerful that progression is, and that you've got a chord 5, 4, chord 1, first inversion, 7, leading note chord, first inversion, and then your chord 1 again in root position. And you can see that the bass is moving down by step, G, F, E, D, C. So again, very powerful chord progression that you can actually have the bass line moving down by step like that, and all the other voice parts move very, very little. In fact, I think the biggest leap there is between the first two chords, between the D in the alto part and the F in the alto parts. The biggest leap is a third, and that's hardly anything. And there you can actually see that between the second and third chords, in the tenor part, the C doesn't move at all, so it stays in the C from one chord to the next. Very strong, good idea to do that as well. And you can also see one of the other rules, that the B in that chord 7 is in the soprano line. So it's in first inversion that you have the D at the bottom, and you can actually see the B at the top is rising up to that tonic. Okay, so a lot to take in with the leading note chord, but if you just want to memorize that the leading note chord is basically used 9 times out of 10, it is used in accordance with chord 1. In fact, it's usually flanked by two chord 1s, one of which will be inverted. That's all you need to really remember. We'll go into greater detail later about this passing 6-3 progression on the left, and how the leading note can be used as a cadential chord as well, as you can see on the right. So we'll go into that in more detail later. So just to go back, I suppose, over the consecutive and hidden fifths and octaves. A great way to avoid consecutive and hidden fifths and octaves is to make the outer voices move in opposite directions. Okay, contrary motion. That's another rule to remember. If two adjacent chords have one or more notes in common, keep them in the same parts. So just summarizing what we've gone through already. If the soprano, alto and tenor parts have to move, try and make sure they move as little as possible. In other words, keep the voice leading smooth. And the bass part does like to move about from one chord to the next by rising by a perfect fourth or perfect fifth or falling by a third. But don't be excessive with bass leaps. Use inversions to achieve smoother effects. So all these chord progressions underneath are quite common because the bass is going to be moving up and down by a perfect fourth or fifth or falling by a third. So it's going to be rising by a perfect fourth or fifth and falling by a third. Bass likes to do that. Okay, but don't do it all the time. Try and put the odd inversion in your chords, the odd first inversion, just to make it a bit more smooth. So you don't have to memorize these chord progressions. This is just the result of knowing this rule, that the bass likes to move from one chord to the next by rising by a perfect fourth or fifth or by falling by a third. Okay. So I briefly mentioned this earlier in one of the slides about using the mediant chord maybe in the context of a circle of fifths. I'm just going to go through what a circle of fifths is. So a circle of fifths is a progression in which all the chords share that sort of 5-1 relationship, with the roots of each chord rising in fourths or falling by fifths. So this is probably a chord progression that you would have to get very used to playing. I'd advise you to get to a piano and try playing this chord progression, because it'll actually show you where you would use each chord and what relation can you use each chord on in every single degree of the scale. Every single chord is in there, so you got chord 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 in your circle of fifths. So if you actually look at it, you'll see that the bass is rising by a fourth, then falling by a fifth, rising by a fourth, falling by a fifth, rising by a fourth, falling by a fifth, and rising by a fourth again. Okay, so that movement between chords 1 to 4 to 7 to 3 to 6 to 2 to 5 to 1, that creates the effect that you're moving in a 5-1 relationship the whole way across. So if you'd imagine that chord 4 is really chord 1 in F major. Okay, so that second chord, imagine that you're in F major, that'd be your chord 1. C then is your chord 5. But then that chord 1 in F major becomes itself the chord 5 of the next chord, which is your 7th chord. So it can get a little bit complex here. So you've got to imagine that wherever you see a 1, that's your pretend tonic. Okay, so your chord 4 is your pretend tonic, and so the chord before it is your pretend dominant. Then your chord 7 is your pretend tonic, so the chord before it is your pretend dominant. In other words, your chord 4 would actually be in the key of B major, that would be a chord 5. Okay, and then you have that 5-1 relationship the whole way through. Okay, so it's almost like a series of authentic cadences the whole way to the end of the music. We'll be going over this again later, but for now, I just want to introduce you to it so you can get used to the idea of where each chord can appear in the circle of fifths. So you can see where your median chord is there. It's right in the middle, and it's used before chord 6. There's your chord 2 again. Remember I said it's good as a predominant. It comes before the dominant. 2, 5, 1. Okay. There's your chord 7 being used without chord 1. So you can see that it's usually used with chord 4 actually. Okay. So chord 4 is a good chord that comes before chord 7. So there'll be other slides that I'll be dealing with later on in this course that will be a lot more specific about what chord progressions are good to use. But I just want to introduce you to this idea of the circle of fifths, this idea of a series of 5-1 relationships the whole way across. So each chord shares a 5-1 relationship with the next chord. So the first chord is really, in reality, it's in the key of C major, it's chord 1 to chord 4, but you can actually see that if you pretend that you were in F major, that F major chord, that FAC chord, the second chord, which is really your subdominant chord, imagine that is an F major, that would be your chord 1, and then the C before it is your chord 5. So and then just continue that relationship right to the end. So you have this series of 5-1, 5-1, 5-1, 5-1 the whole way across, and that's very, very powerful in music. It's very common to have that. So don't worry too much about memorizing the circle of fifths just yet. Just get used to the idea of a 5-1 relationship being very strong. It can be used throughout all the chords if they're in this order, and also have this idea of where you can actually use certain chords in relation to each other. 5-1 is a good progression, so 2-5-1 is a good progression, so 6-2-5-1 is a good progression, and so on. Just work your way back, and then you're back to chord 1 again. So you could basically compose a whole piece of music just using these chords in this order. And just to finish up, I want to go through 1 or 2 rules about how to write voice parts. There's only a couple of extra things to do, and that's it for this lesson. Number 1 thing is don't cross the voice parts. Sorry this came out a little bit blurry, this example, but you can see here that the tenor is consistently above the alto. That is really bad. Okay, so the alto is meant to be a higher voice than the tenor, so the tenor shouldn't be singing all the time above the alto. So you can see there that the alto is singing a C, B, A notes in its voice leading, but the tenor part's even higher. It's singing an F, E, C in its progression, in its voice leading. So try to avoid that. In fact, not try to avoid it, just avoid it. Avoid crossing the parts like that. Also, you can see it happens here again. The alto jumps above the soprano. So here you have the E rising up to an A, and then the G falling down to an F in the soprano. That's bad. Okay, so try to avoid that too. And here's another example of it, except this time the bass is above the tenor. In fact, believe it or not, I've seen this quite a few times in Bach, in the music of Bach, that very, very briefly, that the bass line does go a bit higher than the tenor. But for our purposes, just don't cross voice parts. You may see it the odd time in pieces that you're analysing, but don't do it yourself, because there may be very specific circumstances under which it works. Okay, so you don't have to worry about them for this course, so just don't cross voice parts, basically. So that's basically it, guys, for lesson 3. Again, we covered quite a lot in this lesson. The first thing we were looking at was all the different descriptions that you can give chords, like primary, secondary chords, things like that, and also the different motions you can have for melodic writing. You can have parallel, you can have contrary, oblique, or similar motion. You can have disjunct and conjunct motion. So different things to avoid there, ways of describing chords. We also looked at fully diminished and half diminished chords. And then we got into some of the rules about principles of voice leading, things like don't double the thirds of chords, leading notes should always rise, when to use secondary chords, that sort of thing. And the major thing, I think, the big lesson to take away from this lesson is how to avoid how to check for consecutive fifths and octaves, and avoiding hidden fifths and octaves as well. So yeah, look out for that. Go over. I would advise you to study over perfect fifths and octaves. How do you avoid consecutive perfect fifths and octaves? And also the very last thing here as well about not crossing voice parts. So again, if you have any queries or any questions, you can always get in contact with me through the website, or if you have my email, you can always email me directly. If you want to ask me a question in class, that's fine as well. Or if you want to meet up and discuss something in more detail, or if there's another way that you, or another way you were taught something, or if something doesn't make complete sense, please do get in contact with me. As I said, every single lesson that we do is based on the information that was given in the previous lesson. So you need to understand one lesson before moving on to the next. So if it doesn't make sense at this stage, don't leave it. Don't let it fester. Get in contact with me as soon as possible, and I'll arrange to go over it with you. So hopefully you understand some more of the voice leading guidelines that you're going to need to use for the rest of this course.